for having me. I'm really excited to talk to you because, you know, it's I haven't been doing some science communication for that long. I've done a few presentations, sort of more lecture style. This one's going to be a bit different to that, so I'm kind of looking forward to the more conversation style, I think. If anyone wants to interrupt me because something's not clear, I'm more than happy for that, but I think there's going to be some question time at the end. So my name is Chloe Mackallah. I work at CSIRO in Aspendale, which is here in Melbourne. It's down sort of the coast. CSIRO's main Melbourne site is at Clayton, attached to Monash University, but we've got a little site down on the beach where pretty much exclusively climate research is done. It's a really nice little site. It's really close community. It's quite lovely. Although I'm not in there at the moment, I'm working from home because of obviously COVID and everything. So just a little bit about me. My PhD was actually in astrophysics. I'm relatively new to climate science, having joined CSIRO in January last year. Did my PhD at Monash University, finished it a couple of years ago now. I studied cell spectroscopy and low mass evolution of stars. So I was looking at some really ancient stars, analyzing them with some high resolution telescopes and investigating what was going on inside and how they were evolving. And then I changed tack completely, came to CSIRO and started my career in climate science, which is what I'm doing now. So I work in the couple climate model team. I'll talk about couple climate modeling later, and I'll sort of explain what it is because that's it's a bit of a confusing term, I think. Just going through what I'm going to talk about in this presentation, I'm going to cover some of the IPCC stuff. I know everyone here has an interest in climate science, so I'm sure you're all aware of what IPCC is. I just want to highlight a few sort of key points just to make sure that we're all on the same page. I'll talk about the CMIP collaboration, which is a very important piece of work that we're aiming for at the moment. The Access Climate Model is what we've developed here in Australia, mostly at CSIRO, but also with the Bureau of Meteorology. And I'll present some of our more recent results, which is what we're submitting to CMIP. And I'll explain what that is. So the IPCC is the international body for assessing science related to climate change. When they were originally formed in 1988, they had the three objectives of making assessments of the scientific information on climate change, assessing the impacts of climate change, and developing response strategies to challenge climate change. So they essentially wanted to have a look at what was causing climate change, what are the impacts of it, and how are we going to mitigate and adapt to the situation. Which these were the original objectives of the IPCC, and they pretty much haven't changed at all. The IPCC releases a report every 7 years or so, inconsistently sometimes. I think they're locked into a 7-year schedule now, which is the UN has locked them into that. The last report was the 5th report released in 2014, and we're currently working towards the 6th report due for next year. I say next year, although they'll start coming out next year. There's actually 4 different reports, 3 main ones, and a 4th synthesis report that summarizes the other 3 reports. So I think that'll be coming out about 2022, I think, for everything to sort of roll on. They all come out at different times. The IPCC itself doesn't conduct their own research. They provide a meta-analysis of the current research that is available, looking at peer-reviewed journal articles, but also government sources, industrial sources. Largely, it's science, and especially in the first part of the assessment reports, the physical basis are almost exclusively based on science. Then, as they get on, there are more reports from different sources and stuff like that. Directly in the IPCC, the 5th report, so I've got here the synthesis report, which is the sort of the boiled down version of the all 3 major components of the 5th report. Contained 831 authors. That's 831 people writing the actual IPCC reports, not 100 not 831 authors who wrote the papers that it was based on. It was actually tens of thousands of scientists contributed to all of the papers that were cited. They didn't conduct any of their own science. They exclusively referenced scientific peer-reviewed articles that had come out in the sort of the leading up 7 years. We've got a deadline later this year of getting all of the papers in for the next IPCC report, which they're currently drafting up. The IPCC then goes through some review stages. It goes through about 3 review stages, 2 scientific and 1 governmental, 1 UN-based. They attract anyone is able to review it. They obviously prioritize people with a scientific background. Thousands of reviews from all over the country were given to IPCC report. It really demonstrates that it was a global effort of all climate scientists and all scientists that have anything to do with anything remotely related to climate science contributed heavily to this. And it's really exciting to see it come together every 7 years and just get more and more rigorous as the science sort of evolves. The observations that they made, I pulled these straight from the synthesis report from 2014. As none of it will be shocking to you, I'm sure. There's an 0.85 degree warming between 1880 and 2012. About a 200-meter rise in the sea levels since 1901, and a 26% increase in ocean acidity, which is at least as important as the sea level rise. The acidity affects things like the Great Barrier Reef, many different ecosystems quite directly. The rise in acidity goes along with temperature increases in the ocean as well. Comparing the observed warming, which is the black bar at the top, with the next 3 bars are the anthropogenic contribution to the warming, as they got from all the peer review papers. The green line represents greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide mostly. Other anthropogenic forcings represent things like aerosols. When carbon dioxide is burned and when pretty much all of the greenhouse gases are emitted, you get a lot of other aerosols, which I could try and list for you, but I'm not going to attempt. Often they actually cool the atmosphere. Like when you have a volcano erupt, you get a lot of aerosols and the climate actually cools. Obviously there's a balance between those, and the balance is heavily on the warming side, as you can see with the orange bar, which lines up quite well with the global warming there. As you can see, I don't know if I can be able to see my mouse here. Yeah, so global warming, about in this graph, we've got about 0.6, about 6.5 warming. And then they've estimated that the anthropogenic forcings have contributed more than that. Obviously, we've got some error bars here, so there's a lot of uncertainty when it comes to all of the feedbacks in the climate system. These 2 bars at the bottom represent the natural variability, natural forcings from things like volcano eruptions in the meantime, and natural internal variability in the way that the climate shifts with regard to El Nino and cycles like that. As you can see, they represent very, very small fractions here. The climate, as I'm sure you would know, the climate does change naturally over time. It evolves very, very slowly over time. It takes many millennia for the observed warming that we see here to occur on a natural time frame. We're talking millions of years, not 150. In the AR5, they presented, the AR5 is the assessment review 5, they presented a number of projections under various scenarios. There was 4 main scenarios that they laid out. They're called RCPs, which were, I can't remember what RCP stands for because when you use a different term currently in the current phase. However, they've got these 4 different scenarios between RCP 2.6 is low emissions, it has a high amount of mitigation, it's essentially best case scenario. out to RCP 8.5, which is essentially worst case scenario of high emissions. Under the low emission scenario, we see a global increase in temperatures of around a degree according to the models that they used here. Under the high emission scenario, we're seeing a global increase of about 4 degrees. These are based on models run up to the year about 2013. However, the models themselves only ran to historically to about 2007, and then were projected out from the year 2007, even though there was a small amount of time here that actually did elapse between these. So that's IPCC. I can talk more about that if anyone has any specific questions. I skipped over the impacts and mitigation aspects of it because they're just not my specialty. And I sort of wanted to talk more about the modeling as it contributes. So CMIP is a really important project that we're working towards at the moment. CMIP essentially is a global collaboration. Started in 1995, as the World Climate Research Program established it in order to line up all of the climate research that's currently happening in all of the modeling groups around the world. They wanted to essentially lay down some fixed experiments that everyone can do that are exactly the same forcings. So essentially, they lay down exactly the same amounts of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, different proportions of aerosols, those kind of solar forcings, a whole bunch of different aspects. Everyone runs their own model on these assumptions, and then we compare the results to see how they differ. The first CMIP phase in 1996 was a single experiment. They didn't even, my cat's trying to get into the room. They ran a single experiment. It was purely a pre-industrial control experiment where they fixed the atmospheric conditions to about 1850, and they ran it for a few hundred years to just compare, just to see how each model compares in temperature and variability, having a look at the response to El Nino and things like that. As they went on, as the CMIP phases continued, they added more experiments. As you can see here, in the current phase, CMIP 6, which we're working on at the moment, 299 experiments covering a huge range of scenarios, from mostly a lot of historical experiments up to the year 2014, and obviously a lot of projections out to 2100. There was also a number of idealized experiments. In the first CMIP phase, 18 different modeling groups contributed to this. So just 18 models were compared that ran these experiments. At the moment, we're expecting about 124 different models from about 50 different modeling groups around the world, including CSIRO, the UK Met Office, several different departments in the United States, a range of different facilities in China, Japan, South Africa, Korea, pretty much everywhere, which is really fascinating. And it's an absolutely gigantic data set. We've produced about 70 terabytes worth of data for CMIP 6 so far. We're likely to increase that by about 50% by the time we're finished. In total, CMIP 6 will be expected to contain petabytes of data, thousands of terabytes of data, which is just an enormous amount of data to do some incredible research on. The robustness of the research that you can do on that much data will provide so much more insights than we've been able to before. It's going to be some really interesting times once all of the models are run, which is currently what we're doing. The analysis phase has started there. So yes, this international coordination, the common experiments, it's really laid the groundwork for the next stage of climate research. We're not running single models and having a look at them and trying to work out details of the atmosphere and the climate system on single models. We're looking at dozens, over 100 now different models, independently developed at different sites around the world. CMIP 6, the current phase. There actually wasn't a CMIP 4. They skipped number 4 and went straight to number 5. I think they wanted to line it up with the IPCC reports. The CMIP 6 lines up with the AR6 report for next year. They wanted to look at some specific things when it came to CMIP 6. They wanted to lay down what their focuses were so that the experiments then followed what we really wanted to investigate. Things like clouds and the sensitivity of the climate to different forcings. Sea ice and land ice obviously are hugely important as we move forward. Extreme events, heat waves, and the occurrence of cyclones is really interesting as we look at different scenarios. Water and food availability in more of an impacts perspective. Sea level change, of course, the carbon cycle, and understanding what happens when we do put lots of carbon into the atmosphere really quickly, and where it all goes, how it goes into the land, what goes into the ocean, these kind of understandings. And near-term prediction on a decadal time scale, 20 to 30 years is actually a really difficult time scale to do climate projections on. We can do weather forecasting of a couple of weeks and it's quite robust. We can do climate research, which is mostly what I do, out centuries long experiments, and we can get quite good good statistics there. But in sort of the 2 to 3 decade range, it's actually quite challenging. So we've got a large group at CSIRO working towards that. So we want to understand the Earth's response to different forcings, the biases between the models. Obviously, no model is perfect. Any person who works on models will tell you that no model is right, but many of them are useful. They're useful for understanding the system. They're not there to replicate it perfectly, and they just never will, because to do so, we'd have to create an entire new planet, which we just don't have the, obviously, the terraforming ability to do. And we want to understand the variability in the climate system and how well we can predict future scenarios. Australia's climate model is called ACCESS. It's the Australian Community Climate and Earth System Simulator. There's many different versions of ACCESS. ACCESS is a family of models, 2 of which we're using at CSIRO to submit to CMIP 6. However, the Bureau of Meteorology have a specific version of ACCESS, which is what they do all of their numerical weather predictions for. So all of the weather that you see coming out of the Bureau of Meteorology is created with a version of ACCESS. We use a different one that's tuned specifically for global as opposed to Australia only, and long-term predictions. I want to explain what a coupled climate model is, which is obviously sort of a key term here. The climate model and the coupled climate models that everyone uses now to do these kind of research contain different components. It's not a single code, it's not a single model that does everything. We have an ocean component, atmosphere component, land and ice components. We've got aerosols sort of in a separate code on its own that feeds into the atmosphere. A lot of different components that all work through the central coupler, which essentially takes the information and distributes it back out to the different components so that they all work harmoniously, because you want to be able to make sure that you're not losing atmosphere to nowhere, to the ether, I guess, things like that. The ocean can't shrink. Energy mass needs to be contained. Each component is run by basic equations of fluid dynamics, pretty much just fluids moving in and out, responding to heat, responding to forcings. They all work very similarly, but are tuned to do different components, represent different parts of the climate system. We run these on supercomputers. So we run ours on the NCI. The NCI is in Canberra, at part of ANU, and it's the biggest supercomputer in the Southern Hemisphere, I believe. So we run it on one called Gardi, and we use up a huge amount of resourcing, computational resources there. We run this on about 1,000 computer chips, essentially, at a time, and they take many, many months to run. We've run about 3.5 years worth of computer simulations in the last several months. So we're sort of pumping out the data at the moment, running lots of different models. It's a pretty intense time. I will acknowledge the many different collaborators and partners that we have. Universities within Australia, GFDL, and Los Alamos National Laboratory. We have a lot to do with regards to the ocean model. The Met Office, the UK Met Office, based in Exeter, provided us with our atmosphere components, and so we have a lot of work to do with them. So we've got a lot of stuff going on with a lot of different departments all over. Keeps us pretty busy. As I said, we have two separate climate models of versions of Access. We've got Access CM2, which is sort of the state-of-the-art version that we've got now, and it's a physical only model, so it's doesn't represent the carbon cycle, so it doesn't track carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It's tuned essentially to represent the atmosphere and to be as sort of with the most state-of-the-art physics that we can in the atmosphere, especially when it comes to aerosols, and microphysics, cloud microphysics, which are very difficult to model. The Access ESM 1.5 is focused on the carbon cycle, and it tracks carbon emitted out of systems, anthropogenic systems. It tracks us through the ocean, through different phytoplankton in the ocean, through various forms of lands. We've got urban settlements, and you've got farming. The carbon cycle, the movement of carbon in and out of the land and the atmosphere is very different at very different points. So it tracks that, specifically designed to understand how carbon moves through the climate system. We do some very specific experiments with that. I'll give you a brief overview of some of our results. As I said, we've been running models for CMIP6 for about a year now. And so we're sort of getting heavily into the analysis phase while we're still running some additional models. These are the forcings. These are the forcings given to us by CMIP6. These are the standardized experiments for the historical period from 1850 to 2014. And then these are carbon dioxide emissions. And then these are the concentrations of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. These are given to us, and these are run by the same for everyone. Then we see how the climate system responds to these. And so we've got 4 different scenarios, essentially the same as what we have before. They're called shared scenario pathways. Essentially, I'm not sure who it was, somewhere in, someone in CMIP6, there's a group specifically who came up with these scenarios, predicting the different pathways that humanity as a whole might undergo, with the lowest one actually achieving negative emissions in the last few decades, which would be fantastic. Our results to these are global mean temperatures for the historical periods, and then the 4 different scenarios. The solid lines are the Access CM2, and the dotted lines are the other version, the Access ESM. As you can see, under the high emissions scenario, we see increases of about 6 degrees globally with the Access CM2, and about 5 degrees with the Access ESM. They give different responses because the Access CM2 has some updated physics in it that are more sensitive to the carbon dioxide increases in the atmosphere, and actually predicts higher temperatures as a result, which is relatively new effect that we're seeing in climate models. And we're starting to disentangle that to see how realistic that is or isn't, where it comes from, and sort of what we're going to do with that information. Under the lowest emission scenario, the SSP 126, we call it, this purple line here, we're seeing global increases in temperature of about 2 degrees. Meaning, and this is sort of the kicker for this low emissions scenario, is that even under the absolute lowest emission scenario that we were able to come up with, the Paris Agreement still isn't met globally. We still break that, which has pretty interesting ramifications for discussions about the Paris Agreement, about how realistic it is or isn't. I think that is going to be a big thing that's going to come out of the next IPCC discussions about the implications of that. Some very frightening results that I get out of our scenario predictions are, and one that really hits home for me, what we're seeing here are the sea ice. What I'm showing you is the sea ice area, so the amount of sea ice in the Northern Hemisphere, so Arctic sea ice, in September. September is the warmest part of the year in the Arctic. It's offset slightly from summer. It's the peak temperatures in the ocean are about 3 months offset from as we'd experience in the air. So so the summer peak of the Arctic, under all of the scenarios provided to us, we see the Arctic becoming completely ice-free in summer, meaning in summer we'll have no ocean, no sea ice at all in the Arctic, which has never ever been observed in human history. As far as we know, that hasn't occurred for several million years, and we're likely to see it within the next 30, which is frightening when I first saw this, I have to say. Being very, very close to the models for the first time in the last year and a half, you know, running them myself, seeing the outputs as they come in, it's put me right at the front of seeing these results, and it's hit me pretty hard, I have to say. For Australia, under the high emissions and the low emissions scenario, this is plots of Australia in 2100 under the high emissions scenario and the low emissions. Under low emissions, as you can see, we've got temperature increases of about 2 or 3 degrees in Australia. Under the high emissions scenario, in the most part of Australia, we're seeing temperature increases of 5 or 6 degrees. That's averages. That's yearly averages over this whole region, meaning in summer we're likely to see temperatures peaking above 10 degrees, what we usually expect. Summers under the high emission scenario are going to be very destructive, especially where you've got agriculture happening, things like that. I want to just quickly skip over, because I know I'm kind of running out of time, a few of the different experiments that we've also run, as opposed to just projections into the future. We're not just here to predict doomsday. We want to understand many different parts of the climate. So we run some very specific experiments under ideal conditions in order to understand the responses of the climate system a bit more specifically. Under this experiment, which was done with the Access ESM version, a whole bunch of carbon is increased over 150 years. It's increased at 1% per year for 140 years until it's almost quadrupled in carbon amounts. After 240 years after starting, well, 140 years after the carbon increases begin, we then drop the amount of carbon in the atmosphere out over another 140 years and run it for as long as possible under these, what we call pre-industrial conditions. These aren't meant to represent anything realistic in the climate system. They're just purely idealized. The responses to that are very interesting, because when you increase the carbon dioxide amount by by quite a large amount, you can see that the land portions of the planet increase significantly more than the ocean, which is what you expect. The ocean can take up a lot more heat than the land can. After all that carbon is drawn out of the atmosphere, all of the carbon dioxide that we introduced in this first phase of the experiment has been taken out. So there's no additional carbon in the atmosphere, and yet we see heating, some residual heating that just lingers. Pulling carbon out of the atmosphere after it's introduced pretty much can't undo the damage that's caused by it being introduced in the first place. There's lingering effects even once you remove all of the carbon, which is some really interesting results that have come out. Some additional experiments that we're conducting. Very big one is detection and attribution. What we do is we run a whole bunch of different historical experiments where we turn on and off different parts of the forcings that we apply. We can turn on the anthropogenic forcing and turn off the aerosols, and we can turn on, have the sun on, essentially the solar forcing, but turn everything off. And so what we want to be able to do is separate out all of the different components, so we can see how much of the climate system, the climate warming is caused by solar variability, by natural variability from things like volcanoes, and obviously different anthropogenic sources like aerosols and greenhouse gases, in order to disentangle what the climate is actually experiencing from each of the different components of forcings, the many different components of forcings that it experiences. We've got two different experiments that run like this. We're running these detection attribution experiments at the moment. We're about to start them in the next week. These radiative forcing experiments are specifically for the atmosphere and understanding the role of aerosols in the atmosphere. I actually ran those a couple of months ago, and they're completed now, so we're starting some analysis on that. We want to understand the carbon cycle in as much detail as possible. We've got a lot of oceanographers who are interested in running models of just the ocean itself, just to pull out all of the atmosphere and the land, just to see what the ocean itself does. We've got some colleagues at the University of New South Wales producing some Paleo climatological simulations, which are very interesting. I find them quite fascinating. The prehistorical climate of Earth, as you might know, was very different at different times. In the time of the dinosaurs, 65 million years ago, I think there was no ice anywhere on Earth, no solid ice. Antarctica was completely open land, that kind of thing. And some specific sea ice experiments, because sea ice, as you can see in the plot that I showed before, it's very volatile. It responds very, very quickly to different forcings and different changes in the atmosphere. We're doing a lot of paper writing. I'm writing a paper at the moment, and a lot of my colleagues are doing some analysis. We're running lots of experiments. This cake was made by the leader of our group, my boss's boss. She baked this cake, and as you can see, it's got the actual results from the historical and scenarios here. And she baked this cake for us in celebration of the first lot of data that we produced that went to CMIP 6 itself and are now available online for researchers all across the planet to do research on. So that was a fun little day. I thought I'd show that because it's pretty cute. That's it for me.